The panel here going down to my left, first we have Chris Reddy, who's a senior scientist at Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution. You've heard me extol the virtues of Woods Hole in the flow rate, but of course they also did a lot of other marvelous things in terms of the scientific response to Deepwater Horizon, and Chris is here to tell you about it. Next to Chris is Steve Murawski, who at the time was working for NOAA, but now he's the director of the Center for Integrated Analysis and Modeling of Gulf Ecosystems at the University of South Florida. Next to Steve is Charlie Henry, who's the director of NOAA's Gulf of Mexico Disaster Response Center. And next to Charlie is Bob Spees, who's already been introduced to you, but in case you have memories of a goldfish, he is a principal at Applied Marine Sciences and chief science advisor to governments on the Exxon Valdez oil spill. And next to Bob is Lucinda Jacobs, who's here from BP. Okay, so this panel is on the role of science in oil spills. So the panelists here have carte blanche to talk about the role of science in prevention, in response, and in restoration after oil spills. So I'm sure we'll hear a little bit about all of those topics. Since I've already had a full speaking slot of my own, I just wanted to talk about one area of science in addressing disasters like oil spills that didn't neatly fit into my previous talk that I know my good friend and co-author Gary Mackless would have my head if I didn't mention, and that is a topic called the Strategic Sciences Group. And the Strategic Sciences Group was born out of Deepwater Horizon, and it was modeled after the World War II OSS. And this was an idea that Gary Mackless brought to me during the very, very early days of Deepwater Horizon and suggested that we start this group. And the idea was that while so many people were focusing on the tactical response of Deepwater Horizon, he thought it would be a good idea that we commission a group to look at the strategic response to the oil spill. And the idea here was that we would look at not what is happening now in terms of the response to the oil, the ecosystem response, and the cascade of consequences, but the cascade of consequences that might lead all the way up to impacts on humans, on human health, and ultimately the economy. And if we could anticipate what that cascade of consequences might ultimately be, perhaps we could intervene at an early time and prevent those consequences from happening by doing something now, early on, in terms of a strategic response. So I thought this was a great idea, so we got together modest resources to build this Strategic Sciences Group by pulling out our Rolodexes and pulling together a group of academic and government scientists from all over the country. And our vision in who should serve on this group is we wanted a scientist who could win a bar fight. And that was the definition of the ideal person to sit on the SSG, a scientist who could win a bar fight. And we walled these people off for several weeks, and they did scenario planning. Scenario planning for the Gulf spill that was already in play. And they worked out various scenarios under various conditions of what was going to happen with the oil, what was happening with the flow rate, when the well might be killed, etc. And what was amazing was just about every scenario they developed played out in one way, shape, or form. And the Department of Interior was so, and they presented their results to the admiral, to the incident commanders, to the NIC, to anyone who would listen. And the Department of Interior was so thrilled with these results that the Strategic Sciences Group has now been codified into Department of Interior way of operating, and they were re-energized during Hurricane Superstorm Sandy and made great contributions to the response and the restoration for Hurricane Sandy. And so I was thinking when Charlie was talking earlier about the importance of scenario planning, that this has become a way of operating now in Department of Interior. So with that, I would like to give the floor to Chris Reddy. It's all yours.
So thank you for having me here. As much as it pains me not to show you a few chromatograms, some unusual big structures, throw some solvents in there, I'm not going to talk about science. I'm not going to talk about science in the context of chromatograms and Excel spreadsheets, but about how academia can play a role and how academia played a role during the Deepwater Horizon, especially in terms of response. And it's about how we can play perhaps even a stronger and more fruitful role in the future. This talk is called An Intersection of Interests. I want to start out with Nancy Kinner. I think Nancy just doesn't get enough credit in terms of running these programs and such. But to me, I had a very important moment in my life about 5 years ago. I was at a meeting, a Nancy Kinner meeting about oil spill response and things like that. And I was a young punk scientist, still am, but I was taken aside after the meeting by Steve Lehman, who's one of the finer NOAA people we have, and he explained to me about how I behave sometimes during oil spills, because I study oil spills, and that perhaps I could be a bigger help if I controlled myself in the future. And I can't say that I have an A in Steve's class, but I might have pulled a gentleman's C during the Deepwater Horizon. I certainly didn't fail, but I certainly give credit to Steve. But one of the take-homes from that meeting was, I think I was the only practicing academic who studied oil spills outside of UNH. I'm pretty sure I was. So that was in 2009. But I want to talk about the Deepwater Horizon. You want to think about, from academia's perspective, that this was, you got to use unprecedented when you talk about Deepwater Horizon, an unprecedented hydrostatic test. We put a test on academia that we were not used to. Our hydrostatic test, a test for strengths and weaknesses, typically is about getting tenure, getting papers published, getting promotions, more lab space, more postdocs, more graduate students. That's the test that we live by, and that's what we usually live by. All of a sudden, we're put at 1,500 meters below the sea surface, 50 miles off the coast, a lot more players and a lot more oil. And this new hydrostatic test found new strengths and found new weaknesses and some challenges. And I'm going to talk about them today and about how we can pave the way for the future. I think that academia, especially in the latter halves of this spill, has taken a cordless phone technology from the 80s that I don't think has moved much forward since the Ixchak and put it into the iPhone world. I think academia has brought science way ahead in oil spill science. I think that if you were an academic and you didn't have tenure and you did the kind of work that I saw day in and day out in terms of what our expectations are within our own culture, you would get tenure. You might even get a bigger raise. We did our science fast. We did it fantastic. We had new questions. We did excellence. We were passionate. We actually trained new people who hadn't even thought about science. A lot of people think oil spills are dirty, both literally and figuratively. We got the new science in there, the talent pool that we could have. We were nimble. We were opportunistic. We took our past experience to the table, and we used them. And with our own cultures, we excelled. There's no doubt. I'm absolutely confident. And we're moving the field forward more and more. If there's a takeaway, if there's a silver lining from this cloud, is that there's a lot more science content and talent out there thinking about spills in the future. Here's the rub, though. We did great, but we were on a little tiny old main street in a little town, bumping up against a much bigger series of roads in a superhighway called Stopping the Spill and reducing damages. There are many other interests at stake that were going on the spill, and I think academia had not quite understood that there was a potential, well, let's just say, an intersection of interests. We had people who wanted to do a great job. We had people thinking about it. Companies trying to keep their stock prices up. Newspapers trying to be sold. I'm trying to get a paper published in Science. Not pushing Marcia now. But the point of the matter is that I think one of the key things about this is that we all got put on a head course. I don't think academia quite understood and did have a very good roadmap. We did not have Google Map for this in this case. And I think one of the reasons why is that I don't think we understood the cogs and the machinery that goes on during a disaster of this scale. I don't think they understand that one way or the other, what we say and what we do, often to the media, and that goes back to the lay public, and what we don't do and what we don't deliver is all part of this massive cog machinery. And I think we have to recognize that each one of these cogs has a different role. We all have a different culture. We have jobs to do and succeed. A lot of us have something to lose and gain. We all work on timescales and certainty. You just can't talk about, and it was talked about earlier. A scientist wants to get tenure in 8 years and can only publish papers with about 95% certainty. And the memory of my field is long. You make a mistake, that memory is for a long time. You will have that legacy on your back for a long time. During a response, you have 8 hours. And, maybe 75% certainty is pretty good. The media may be going to press in 8 minutes, and their certainty may be a little bit lower. And their legacy may not last as long. You might be able to file a bad story, and the next day you just go back over again. So we have to understand all these different timescales and certainties. And also, I think that you have to recognize that when you're an academic coming into play, some of these other cogs have pre-existing relationships. They already feel comfortable with each other. And I think a lot of other folks have a greater understanding of how the media works. To me, I look at this, and I think the media is the engine that drives this as much as we like it or not. So here's the deal in academia, for the most part. I'm going to generalize like crazy. We didn't get invited to this party. We just didn't. They didn't know our address. They didn't know who we were. So what happened was we crashed it. There was no invite. We crashed it, and we went on this party. I shouldn't say party. I'm being a little cute. That's insincere towards a disaster. The point of the matter is we went on Uncle Sam's dime. The capacity for us to do this science was off the National Science Foundation's rapid grants. That was the way we did it. Because, in fact, scientists are often opportunistic. They look for good science questions, and they go to the place we usually go to. You got a good science question? You go to the National Science Foundation. But we brought our own talent. We only wanted to do what we thought was important. And I'll say, we didn't always get welcomed with open arms when we did crash the party. Understandable, maybe. And we may not have ingratiated ourselves in the way in which we handled ourselves before we showed up at the party or while we were still at this party after we crashed it. So I'm going to give you an example about how we were really strong and perhaps we showed some of our weaknesses. It has to do with subsurface plumes. I think from an oceanographic perspective, it could be one of the more fascinating outcomes of the spill. And when this spill was occurring in May and June, there was great work being done. The rub is most of the best talent that could study oil spills or methane cycling all looked at the same problem. We were very much focused on one topic, in part because it's really cool. It's fascinating. And so I think that we had a lot of good, talented people all doing the same thing. And the end result is that I think we ended up addressing what we found scientifically interesting. but we're not very well coordinated, perhaps a little over competitive. I called the editor of science on a sat phone from the bow of the Endeavor trying to hawk a paper before I even wrote it. So, that's where I didn't do so well in Steve's class, Steve Lehman's class. So, and I don't think we perhaps maybe translated those results in the right context or understood the prism in which what we say goes out and through a black box out into the real public. Somebody once told me after this spill, and I was showing a bunch of figures about how great I was for this work on the plumes, and somebody said, "You used all the good boats." And it took me a long time to figure out what they were saying was, you were using all the good research vessels and all the good talent to worry about one problem. But I would argue, too, that we were also in the fog of war, and I would mimic what Marcia McNutt said, that it's hard to be it's hard when you're in the battle. This is a hard place. Exxon Valdez was very much like Pearl Harbor. This was the Battle of Stalingrad. It's a long, hard fight. So think about this work in terms of us trying to look for subsurface plumes. You can think about this from two ways. We were doing some really cool work, but I don't think the big picture was grabbed. But on the flip side, and this is in the title that Nancy put together, it's in response, could we have used all the assets that we had in place to do the best available work on the timescales of a response with what we had in place? And I don't think we did. And I don't think we also understood the big picture that it became a competition about publishing and who comes first because that's our value system. I got to publish first. I can't get scooped. That's our value system. Our value system isn't necessarily always we got to stop this oil or we're going to reduce damages. Our BP's got to keep their stock up. I mean, as much as you like it or not, I'm going to get promoted on papers and publications. But I also don't think respondents saw our value. And I was trying to find a good place in this talk to put it in there, so I had national crisis, so I have to put it in there. This was a national crisis. This was a national spill. It brought national academics in place. I think in the next spill, wherever it is, we have to get past the idea that the scientific content and that we can bring to the table from academia is not going to come from that region of interest. If there's an Arctic spill, it's not just going to be scientists from the Northwest. We're going to bring all that talent to the table. So we have to recognize that as much as we want to have regional plans, we have to think about these that on scales of deep water and such, it is a national crisis. So I'm going to summarize a little bit about academia. I could talk forever about this. But I think on our timescales, what we value and what we use in our culture, we excelled. But we were not ready for the immersion of Deepwater Horizon. This was a multicultural, multi-language, all over the place map, anthropology class, many, many classes. And I got to throw this in here. It doesn't really fit. But I think a lot of environmental scientists became environmentalists. I think they became biased. I think they became angry at the government and BP. A scientist should not be angry at those entities. We should be angry at the oil. We should be asking questions about how we contain the oil, how we can stop the oil, how we can reduce damages, how can we ascertain damages and assessment and restoration. This other stuff is not our problem. And I think we have to keep that in mind in the future. Pre-existing relationships, time and time again, showed that they worked. If you saw the talks from Larry and Nancy this morning, UNH is a classic example who had funding before, extramural funding with NOAA, and they were able to get in play and were valuable resources. So there's something to be said there. In defense of us, we never got to see the table. Nobody asked us what to do, so we did what we thought was interesting. Beyond the NSF, there wasn't much money. And, I don't think we had a very good reputation. And I don't think many people understand how academia works. And I can't beat the drum enough, but as much as we didn't know everybody else's culture, they didn't know ours. That we are painfully afraid of making a mistake because one mistake is a scarlet letter on your career. And so that has to be put in the context of why we might be a little nervous about giving a figure when it's not peer-reviewed. So what can academia do? on our end? Well, the first thing everybody says is, we've got to give them media training. If we teach them an elevator speech, the world's going to be saved. That is maybe one class in a grander course that I envision that needs to be taught to graduate students. You know, back in the day, if you were a chemistry graduate student working on your PhD, you had to show a proficiency for German or French or another language so that if you had to read another paper, if you had ventured out of your comfort zone of English, that you'd be able to get by. You would be able to do that. I think it's time for us to not necessarily learn a new language, but to learn a new culture, learn an understanding about how everything else works. Have a class about what's outside the ivory tower. Why can't we have a series of workshops in graduate program, not huge, and based on invited lecturers from different places explaining what goes on during a crisis, whether it's acute or whether it's chronic, and so that we can enrich each other. And in theory, these trainers who we bring in can also learn about us. Here, Professor Steve Lehman would be the first one in my book. So he's great in terms of scientific response and science coordinators, which is the first place you want to do. The ultimate goal is that if you give this type of training, which is doable and it's not that expensive, and I think students would love doing it, you can take a scientist, an academic who may think only in a two-dimensional sense, looking at a nautical chart, and perhaps raise up their perspective when it comes to a crisis, when we're outside the ivory tower, that it might be a little bit more richer and have much more facets to it and more on the globe. I'm not going to get into the game of a crisis, and in my case, why would I want to get into a crisis when thousands of my emails were subpoenaed by BP? What's in it for me? Well, beyond personal satisfaction, sooner or later we have to incentivize. There has to be a place for academics to be involved. Right now there isn't anything there. If you want me involved in a spill, we have to figure out a way so that the upper management in academia and other pushers and stressors can say, you know what? You did a really great job in the Deepwater Horizon. You never did anything, never on a boat, but you were at incident command and you were reading papers and writing review articles for the FOSC. That's invaluable. But if you try to put that on your tenure file today, it's nothing. That's like judging the science fair. We gotta bring a much bigger value for these contributions as well as to the National Science Foundation. But I think we don't really even need a diploma. I was quitting oil spills. I was done with oil spills. I didn't want to do any more oil spills. I actually didn't even want to work on the Deepwater Horizon until Bob Haddad bullied me into it a couple days after the spill. But it's really interesting. There is another silver lining. For me, it reinvigorated my career. It got me excited about science, and I also got to see other people excited. And I think we're bringing a whole new generation of folk who actually see that oil spill science and crisis science can play an invaluable role in the future. So, if you want us into the game, you got to want this going. You want academia. We're a valuable resource. This machine can't get turned on every time there's a crisis. It's got to run. You can't start up that car every year and think it's going to run smoothly. It's got to run more often, and it's got to get lubricated. With money, and friendships, and exchanging of cultures. And we also have to somehow or another work on this timing chain and understanding certainty, chime, all these little factors in play that will help things go a little bit more smoothly. Visit other cogs maybe, know each other's cogs roles. This would happen by these types of exchanges at one level or the other. So now, we're part of this big machinery. We've been invited. Now we're at a SANS, a spill of national significant exercise. You just can't invite us and ask us to sit back and take a picture with the admiral. You got to put us in the game. You got to challenge us. You got to immerse us. You got to give us a role. And academics have to understand that what we bring to the table during a crisis may not be the novelest, most boutique science that we do. They might just need warm bodies. Good scientists to help make good decisions may be just as important as the newfangled instrument that you just built. So, in the future, I'm wrapping up. Marsha just told me, and I am, so that's great. We have to have a list for us in the future if we're in the game. We've got to have a list ready for us, prepared, and have a means for it to be communicated backwards and forwards. So, challenges for others. You have to accept that academia is not your enemy. We are an invaluable resource. One could even dangerously say that we could be the scientific National Guard in which we're trained and can be mobilized. But you gotta come to us, you gotta learn about us, you gotta understand how academia works, maybe read some papers before this bill happens. Help train us, fund us. You cannot rely on the Gulf of Mexico Research Initiative to solve all problems. It's a big chunk of change that came from BP, but it's not gonna address some of these issues. Help with incentives, build relationships, and set new ground rules. We need to help academics understand the rules in place so that we'll be more willing to play. Now, a lot of these things, when I was putting them together, it sounds like what my dad gave me for advice when I was getting married. You know, get along, the in-laws aren't married, you gotta do this, try to get money from them, you gotta build relationships. But you know what? It's kind of true. Because we may not get along with our in-laws, we may not get along with the responders, we may not get along with industry, but we're gonna have to deal with it. We gotta get along good enough so that we can make life bearable and we can get through and have a fruitful life. So, what are we gonna do? We're gonna put some traffic controls at the end of the day so this intersection of interest still is gonna be a little hairy, might have a fender bender, but at least it's gonna be better. We can do this. I think it's better now, because of discussions like this, because of GOMRI and other things. But I think we can even do more in the future. So, thank you.
It's a hard thing to follow marital advice from Chris Reddy.
That's my dad, actually.
Okay. So my perspectives, as Marcia said, are two. Number one, during this bill, I was the chief scientist at the National Marine Fisheries Service and became one of Jane Lubchenco's advisors on the oil spill. Then after the spill, I'm basically taking some of BP's money to look in depth at some of the scientific issues that are residual from Deepwater Horizon. So I've become, the academic traffic light there a little bit. So what I wanted to do is to maybe go over a few of the challenges as I see them from both of these perspectives, and it'll resonate, I think, a little bit with not only this panel but also the previous one. In terms of some of the science issues from the Deepwater spill that seem to be carrying on, I do think that, and Admiral Allen put his finger on it this morning. I didn't actually realize he was going to be here, but that. April 19th, 2010, we were very well prepared to fight the Exxon Valdez spill again. And in fact, probably over-prepared for that. And like all good war textbooks tell you, you always tend to train to fight the war you already had. Obviously, with something like Deepwater Horizon, there's very unique behaviors that were anticipated in theory and predicted, but never really addressed. And so, and I think Admiral Allen's quote, which is now infamous or famous, is that we are finding an omnidirectional, almost indeterminate threat here. And Chris alluded to this, that the academic community was focused on the deepwater plumes. At the same time, we were fighting 6 or 7 other major issues at the same time. And so, people's attention span only goes so far in all of this. And I think that the notion that, the indeterminacy of this was really interesting because, there were bits and pieces of data coming in from various cruises that there was oil suspended in the deep water. And then, it got to be such a media food fight that we got to thinking, is it possible that we actually have liquid oil that might be down in some subsurface, layer that might come popping up God knows where? So at that point, we put a lot more ships on the thing just to make sure what we were dealing with. And when we, basically realized this was a mist that was down there that, was traveling at slow rates, we put some of those ships in something else, just because there were so many issues that were there. Another, and of course, the residual of all of that is, this is probably a behavior to be expected in the future, and so therefore, what will our response to this be in the future? And I think therein lies some really compelling and open scientific questions that Marcia alluded to. Next issue I wanted to concentrate on was the environmental baselines, pre and post spill, and Admiral Allen talked about this before. It's actually embarrassing how poor the pre-spill baselines in many of the environmental areas are, and it makes the interpretation of the impacts of Deepwater Horizon that much more difficult, and I'll talk about that in a minute. And then, what are our science priorities moving forward? And I think Chris got a lot of them in terms of how scientists operate. So, In terms of a deep water spill like this, there was actually some quite good work that was done on a theoretical basis by Scott Sokolowski, Eric Adams, and others that predicted the formation of these plumes at intermediate layers. And of course, the real question is, did injection of deep dispersants do anything other than basically maybe make some particles a bit smaller? And this is a really tough question. We don't get a do-over. On the other hand, right now I think it's the operating model in this industry that if we have another spill like this, that they will inject millions of barrels or gallons of dispersants as an agent to try to reduce the amount of oil coming to the surface. And as Marcia said, the evidence of the efficacy of that is anecdotal. There's never been a thorough analysis of VOCs at the surface. Remember that an oil droplet of the sizes that we're talking about takes over a day to transit from that wellhead to the surface. And so there's a lot of oceanography that can happen in between the oil coming out of the wellhead and popping up on the surface. So, these observations about what happened there, they would require a lot of work with information from ADCPs and oceanographic, 3D oceanographic modeling, et cetera, just to try to settle the case of, what do we have for evidence? Now, in one sense, we do get a do-over because we can create these kinds of spills in microcosm. And one of the groups that we're working with is in Hamburg, Germany, and they have a pressure cell, basically, that you get the pressure and temperature right, and inject scaled oil and oil dispersant mixes to see if you can actually create this mist. And the bottom line is, yeah, you can create this mist without any dispersants at all. So really, it's the knock-on effect, not necessarily the absence or presence of these plumes and the presence of dispersants that's the problem. And so, this is a classic science problem that requires sustained effort to actually resolve, and potentially it has, millions and billions of dollars of outcome riding on it. And so there are many unresolved questions that have come up as a consequence of the uniqueness of Deepwater Horizon. So the second issue I wanted to talk about was oil on the sea bottom. And this is a graphic that Deb Payton and the group at the Office of Responsive Restoration put together. And this is 6 different ways that oil can get to the bottom. Now, it's pretty clear from a number of papers, including one published this week, that there's a substantial quantity of Deepwater Horizon oil on the bottom in and around the wellhead. And, so how is it that oil does not float? And the answer is it's a fairly complex set of circumstances that requires some ballasting of oil, particularly if it got to the surface. And there's also this unique thing about, if you put oil in a bathtub, you get a bathtub ring around it. And so some of this is obviously part of this. Now, actually resolving which of these mechanisms is important is again, why we need a deep dive in science. Now, the interesting thing is, one aspect of this is we have a sedimentary record of oil pollution in the Gulf of Mexico that's quite compelling, and it actually tells us quite a lot. In particular, it sets a baseline in these sediments so we can actually understand what's going on. And this is a really cool paper that was actually commissioned by NOAA as Presley et al. In 1988. And this is actually one core sample that was taken off Southwest Pass in Louisiana. And what you see is basically a 100-year history of PAH contamination in the various layers that can be dated with lead-210. So what you see is prior to the advent of ocean drilling in the Gulf of Mexico, the PAH levels were quite low, about 200 parts per million in the sediments. And you can see that after 1940, they tripled. Right? And so this is probably a consequence both of the release of small quantities of oil, but also just the use of transportation fuels and residual coming down the Gulf of Mexico. But the important thing is there is some baseline here if you actually try to look for it in places where it might actually be recorded in a record. And in fact, my colleagues and I, when we've looked at other sedimentary records taken post Deepwater Horizon, the scale kind of goes off the chart here and so it's pretty clear that in spite of the fact that the Gulf of Mexico is a complicated place with a lot of potential hydrocarbon inputs, you can actually deconvolve some of this mystery. Now, so in terms of the extension of this, there's lots and lots of core sampling that's going on in the deep areas around the wellhead, and this is just a graphic illustrating many of the places that have had holes punched in them. Probably as much sediment has been taken out of here as a massive dredging project at this point. I'm not sure we got the wherewithal to analyze all these samples, but nevertheless, what you see when you look at these core samples is a really characteristic streak. At first glance, you'd see this is the top of a sediment core up here. This is actually just a sponge to keep the sediment in. But you see this area here, that's not oil itself, it's the redox region, basically the metals in there undergoing decay. And so, and when you do the dating on this is basically Deepwater Horizon, and this is the pre-spill stuff. And so it's pretty clear that, you can follow different lines of evidence for oil that's made it to the bottom. If you actually use the data that it was put up on the IRMA website, and this is data collected by BP and NOAA, you can do some really interesting analysis by looking at the total hydrocarbons in the surface layer of that sediment versus sort of the next layer down. And so this is a change graph, and it's the percent change in hydrocarbons from the period just before Deepwater Horizon to the period after. And the red sites are, a factor of 5 to 38 times the pre-spill evidence. And so there's actually quite a lot of evidence here that, we've got hydrocarbons at some high level. And so trying to understand that we not only have to deal with hydrocarbons on the beaches and the marshes, but that they're going to have some sort of environmental impact is quite unique as an aspect of this spill. Now, as was alluded to before, this wasn't the first blowout in the Gulf of Mexico. In fact, 35 years ago, the Ixtoc spill created a blowout almost equivalent in terms of the total amount of barrels. And so we've been in contact with some Mexican colleagues who had taken some core samples down there. And the interesting thing is, if you look at the horizons in these sediment cores, it's the same type of a redox reaction, but you see it buried under around 6 centimeters of sediment. And of course, that's about the sediment accumulation rate over the past 35 years that you would expect. And so, do 2 data points make a rule? Perhaps. Really important aspects of this, that the oil on the bottom isn't necessarily out of sight, out of mind. In terms of other biological effects, I wanted to emphasize the importance of baselines and biota. I have a number of students that are studying the fishes of the Gulf of Mexico, and in particular these 3 species that occur in the area of the surface aspect of the spill: red snapper, tilefish, and snake eel. This is one of my students here. She's 5'6", right? That eel's about 6 feet. They live in the mud around the outfall of the Mississippi River. And so the point here is that there were no pre-spill samples for any of these species. And what we've seen in the case of red snapper and monitoring their bile, we've seen a fairly significant decline in the contamination levels. But we also see, in terms of these species, vastly different levels of contamination in them, even for animals that are taken at the same place and the same time, which means this is a really complex issue of physiology of the animals, of exposure vectors and other things as well. And so when people say, are the fish doing well or bad, it really is, what fish and what place, and a whole variety of other issues. Ironically, there have been a few comparison studies to the data I just showed you. The tilefish data we have indicate that they're pretty heavily polluted, and they're on an equivalent level with some Exxon Valdez specimens that were taken right at the time of the spill, and also in this case of this Brazil area, that's their main oil terminal area in Brazil. But that, some of the other contamination levels we see are relatively low. I wanted to make mention of one study, and that's called the GOMEX study, that was conducted in the early 1990s, and this is an MMS funded study. That really is the only baseline study for fishes that we can find in the Gulf of Mexico, and of course that was done on 3 gas wells in the western part of Texas. It really shows that we have a dearth of baselines, and that creates all kinds of issues for us in trying to understand the impacts of any particular spill. So improving the baselines, we have, as I said before, we have very few pre-DWH environmental baselines, particularly for the biota. The GOMEX program in the early 1990s was one of very few comprehensive offshore programs. Personally, I think it's in the best interest of the industry to understand these background levels, because in some cases they can be exonerated. And in fact, if you look at the Hercules 265 gas well blowout, that ironically we had a baseline from the vicinity of that area because of the funding for Deepwater Horizon, basically showed that there was no net increase in hydrocarbons. That's an important aspect of this. And another aspect of this improving baselines is what is the oil budget for the Gulf of Mexico? Obviously, there's a lot of natural seeps in an area that's so productive, and so, what is the contribution of natural seeps? What is the contribution of 4,000 pieces of oil infrastructure that are out there? What's the contribution of leaky infrastructure, et cetera? And so if one looks at the oil budget from a 2003 study by the National Academy and compare that with Deepwater Horizon, the total volumes are about 7 times what they had originally calculated, with the other major source being these green dots, which are the natural seeps there. The yellow dots here represent all the known oil infrastructure in the region, and of course, if you look at this, there's a lot of confounding of the spatial overlap of all this, and so we really do need to have careful studies to try to figure this all out if we're ever going to try to understand the impacts of any specific event. So the last issue I wanted to talk about was the complex and dynamic oceanography. At the time of the spill, as Marcia pointed out, there was a lot of concern about where would the spill go, particularly at the surface. One of the really cool things that happened was, and this was a really nice interaction between the academic community and the government community, is that an ensemble of models was actually put together. That means more than just one predictive model of where things would go. This is very much like, those of us who live in the Gulf, we look at the ensemble, the spaghetti plots of hurricanes, right? And so that gives you some sense of the variability of these things. There was actually an ensemble put together, I think, about 8 different models at the time, and so it gave the responders a lot more information about the potential for where things could actually go, and that's an important development. Last slide. What are the science gaps we need to address? Certainly, I think we need to establish and sustain an improved Gulf-wide long-term observing system to improve these environmental baselines. And frankly, I think this should be a cost of business, doing business for the industry. I know that we don't want to put as many regulations on the industries in terms of letting them do their thing, but in the case of $50 billion a year of crude oil coming out of the Gulf of Mexico, having a requirement that the companies periodically do baseline studies and report those would be immensely valuable to all of us. Secondly, developing some unified data management system, getting our hands on all the information that are available and making them with common standards and quality assessments would be enormously valuable. Coordinating project-specific science, the individual science issues that we've got are important. And last, putting this all in the ecosystem context is going to be immensely valuable to all of us. So with that, thank you.
All right, so I'm really happy to see that there's not too many people sleeping in the audience because it's been a long, good day. But I'm really happy to be here today. I'm Charlie Henry, for those that don't know me. I guess my distinction on the 2 events is I actually did work for Dave Kennedy as a chemist during the Exxon Valdez. And then I found myself, after spending 13 years at Louisiana State University, working as part of Dr. Ed Overton's research team at the Institute for Environmental Studies, I went to work for NOAA in 1998 as the Gulf of Mexico Scientific Support Coordinator, and which is one of, at that time, 9 different SSCs around the country, which was providing that role of leading a lot of the science consultation and support to the federal government during a response, and I'll touch on that. But the 2 slides that I show up here kind of make the connection, which I think is part of how this workshop is set up. The Valdez spill, and what's interesting, this actual photo, which has been seen several times already today, was always in my office when I was at LSU, because that's the connection between the Exxon Valdez and the Exxon tanker Baton Rouge. So I thought that Exxon Baton Rouge connection linked real well with me being from Baton Rouge and working a spill in Valdez, Alaska. The second picture kind of is that 20-something years later, the other part of our spectrum in the wake of the of the Deepwater Horizon event. This is actually a photograph. It was our first photograph that we had during that response. Coast Guard responded real quickly. I get a phone call a couple hours after the explosion from Marine Safety Unit Morgan City, alerting me to the problem. There's a lot we don't know. We start working the issues on what little information we know. We knew there were, at that time, I think it was like 26 people missing, and search and rescue was one of the primary operations. But we start looking at it from what the other consequences could be and what issues we may have. And so this photo arrived, I guess, at about 4:30 in the morning, maybe 5, the time I got from my house and did some initial work and got down to Morgan City. And it actually came from a cell phone. That's how technology has changed. Someone took a cell phone image, was able to send it, and that was the first picture we had to start figuring out what was going on. So that kind of shows that connection. Disclaimer, whatever I say, don't hold NOAA Department of Commerce accountable. Uh-oh. It's a standard disclaimer. Right. So, I know we had a lot of folks that aren't part of our spill response community, and a lot of folks from the university here that may not understand where we come from as NOAA. So I just want to touch real quickly on the little part of NOAA that I work for, and that's the NOAA Hazmat program. Actually, it's evolved over the years into what's known as the Office of Response and Restoration. But the history, what we kind of call our birthday spill, and it goes before I was involved, even though I'm kind of catching up with Dave on the gray hair. But 1976, I was in the Air Force out in the desert of Nevada, so I wasn't there. But the birthday spill kind of for our group is the Argo Merchant Oil spill. And that's kind of when we filled that role, supporting the Coast Guard as a science advisor, helping coordinate, working with academia and other groups on that major event. At the time, it was a group that was also responding, looking at spills, called the Spill Oil Research Team. There was other work going on in Alaska in preparation for exploration, and it was the OCSEP program. But bottom line is, we've been doing it for a long time, and many of the folks that are here in this group have been with the team for a long time. We have a very long corporate history in our organization. So what do we do? One way to try to look at it is that in the role as the SSC in bringing science to the table to support the response operations, the response activity, is that we kind of leverage science. Or me being from the South or from Louisiana, we use science. We want to use science to help solve problems, to better understand the situation, so we can provide better advice to emergency events. And for my group, that involves all hazards. Not just oil spills or chemical spills. It's the same kind of approach we take at looking at consequence manage or looking at the potential impact from such as natural events as a hurricane, with the forecast modeling, looking what's at risk, et cetera. And I kind of always try to bring it down that, and kind of, to contrast a little bit between Steve and Chris, we're partners that I've had for a while. I'm an applied scientist. We get in the field, we draw from a lot of science, and we apply that to look and solve problems. And part of what we're doing is trying to take a complex problem, and we're trying to use science to better understand that problem. And I like to describe it as so I can paint a better picture for the decision makers on what the situation is, what the threat is, what the potential consequences are during the response, so we can make the best decision that results in the least threat to the public, the least impact to responders that are risking their lives in the response, and protect the environment and protect property. And in that order, public first, protect the people who are responding, protect the environment. That's real important to us. So we have to paint that picture to have an understanding so we can think of what's the best path forward. Often early on in an event like the Deepwater Horizon, we don't know what's going on. It's dark. Anyone that could tell us is probably dead. It was a very difficult situation to gather early information. That's often the case. Early information during emergency response is incomplete, it's inconsistent, and sometimes just wrong. And we have to sort through that. And we have to use science, ocean observing systems, other types of models, other types of information to try to cull out what's real and not real, so that we continue to develop a better understanding of the problem, so that we can paint a picture for the FOSC to make the decision on the path we go forward. And kind of jumped over it. So this is just kind of showing, as more and more information is available with better and better resolution. And this is a picture of one of our folks that's Debbie Payton was in the audience here during the Exxon Valdez oil spill. And I also want to point out that, by chance, she's sitting right next to Jackie Michelle, because I think my next point, well, I didn't have a slide, but the point was that no two spills are the same. You've heard that before. Jackie says it every time. Exxon Valdez oil spill in Alaska with this gravel-type beaches, very different type of environment than Deepwater Horizon, warmer Gulf of Mexico, coastal marshes, and sand beaches. Very different types of environment. Two different types of oil, different habitats, different environment. You know, you're going to have different spills. If it was so easy, doing my job would be nice, because if it was just one oil and one type of world, then what we do as far as our support to the Coast Guard, we'd only have to write it up as one paper or one publication or one manual, and we would repeat it every time because everything would be consistent. But it's not. Every spill is different. We have to take what we learned from the past. And kind of how we've summarized it down in my group, applying science to try to solve problems and develop the best response with these common goals in mind to protect the public, protect the responders, and protect the environment, is we look at it and apply science addressing these 5 questions. What got spilled? In the case of an oil spill, oil chemistry. What makes up this oil? What's unique? What's different? Can we track it in the environment? Fingerprinting, applying different tools to look at oil. Is it going to emulsify? How much is going to evaporate, et cetera? Where is it going? That's a trajectory modeling. And I think Steve hit around the point that during the Deepwater Horizon oil spill, there was a lot more modeling and a lot more observing systems available to help us calibrate those models and to make predictions, so that the improvements were there. I was talking to Debbie not long ago, actually through email exchange, when I was thinking about some comments to make. I said, well, what about during the Exxon Valdez? He said, it was sketchy. I guess what I read between the lines, between your thing, it was almost nothing. And so there's how things have changed. But I think she also said in that email that while the Gulf of Mexico and many regions have a lot of information and continue to have more information available, the Arctic is still kind of sketchy, right? We might still be with a lot of unknowns and poor resolution as we predict where that oil may go in a spill in that area. So not only where's it going to go, but what's at risk? And we do a lot of work at looking ahead of time and contingency planning at resources at risk, with a variety of perspectives, including atlases that we call environmental sensitivity indexes, which kind of rate what habitats are more sensitive to different types of spills. We also want to look at how's it going to hurt. And that involves a lot of things, not only just toxicology, but simple physics at times on how ecosystems could be damaged by oil during the spill. And that factors into protected strategies on what's most important and where we try to protect first, and what type of techniques we use for cleanup, because we're guided this whole time by doing no more harm than good. Number one important. We also have a question, so the other part of my Office of Response and Restoration, but how did it hurt, the natural resource damage assessment. Okay. We do pull together groups of scientists, not only groups within our program, and this shows the war room, or we should call it more the science room, in Seattle, Washington during the Deepwater Horizon as they're meeting and discussing a different topic, probably a conference call coming in from the field, probably Steve or Ed with a question that they're working on developing strategic strategies that we take forward into planning as part of the planning group, the planning section during an incident command. And you could also go back to Deepwater Horizon, because you have the home team, which is what I just showed. Then you always have an away team. And this is an away team during the Exxon Valdez spill. I think it was at the Westmark Hotel. And I think, well, there's Dave up there, and I think Jackie, and Luke Consigliere, looks like Tim Riley. And I think that's me in the far back sitting there going like, when can I go home? But that's okay. It's all good. So I wanted to kind of tie it back to another little topic, and then, how originally I was going to show how things may have been different on a couple of alternative technologies between the Exxon Valdez and Deepwater Horizon, and there has been a lot. We did a lot of different things during the Exxon Valdez, or looked at them, but there was always an uncomfort factor with a lot of them. Between those two spills, a lot of research was done. I think people have forgotten just how much work was done. Well, Tom's in the audience, I think you may talk about it. A lot of work was done on looking at dispersants and shoreline type cleaners and looking at in situ burn. Al Allen did a huge amount of work. I don't know how much oil we burned down at Little Sand Island in Mobile, testing booms and trajectory models for oil. So a lot of work was done to enhance our understanding of those tools so that in that event, whatever that spill was, the type of oil, the environment, we could have a better prediction of what might be the consequences, where it was going to go. But I did want to touch very quickly on the subsurface issue. That was one that I think that, I was walking in the hall, I think a couple of days after the vessel had, the rig actually sank and got hit in the hallway by Doug Suttles, who says, Charlie, we got a proposal. What do you think about this subsurface injection of dispersants right at the wellhead, or right at the riser, the broken part of the riser? And he had some information, and he tasked it to the environmental unit in Roberts, where I was working for Admiral Landry as part of her science team, or in the environmental unit. And so we picked it up and ran with it. And we do like we do just those 5 questions, the same kind of approach. It's why we apply science to the problem. We wanted to first have to work out a few operational authority issues, but we had discussions where it was going to work or not. We had lots of questions on it. This was new, not been done. Where was it going to go? We had to think about transport. What was at risk, and how would it hurt? What is in that deep ocean environment? It's very different than the upper ocean environment. It moves in different directions. The animals that live in that environment are very different. They're under different types of stresses. They have different types of factors that actually change what their sensitivities are compared to animals that may be at the surface. What are those overall trade-offs? Is there a benefit? Is it less bad for the environment to do this? And how can we monitor it, not only look at whether it works or not, which you might call efficacy, proof of action, but what the potential effects would be. And to do that, we had to develop what we called an adaptive management strategy. And so, like science, we had a hypothesis. We worked through the issues. We thought this is how it should behave. And we thought these are what the results would be. And we thought from everyone we could talk about and pulling the information together, this is what the biggest consequence would be that we would be most worried about. And that happened to be hypoxia. So we took this, what we call a minimum regret approach, an adaptive management strategy. And it became, in many ways, and I hate to tell you, Bethany, but this became a science experiment in your backyard because there was no other choice but to do it this way. And what we also did is convene a group of scientists and other regulatory people. In fact, Nancy Kinner did it several weeks afterwards to say, this is what we know, this is what we're doing, are we missing something? So we reached out to a larger academic community. And that's kind of how we apply science. And I know I'm running out of time, but we did collect a lot of data. I wish we could have done more to look at the science of it, but it wasn't a scientific experiment. We tried it many times to do some science, but we were restricted that we were an operational activity during a spill and not a research project. And with that, we always try to learn and apply it to the next spill. So we did learn a lot, and the data's still coming out. And I'm out of time, so I'm going to quit right there.
Bob, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Marcia. I had my 22 and a half minutes this morning in my PowerPoint slides, but I thought I'd take a few minutes to add some comments to what has already been said. I think it's been a good series of talks. And I come from a little bit of a historical perspective. I started studying oil seeps in 1975 in the Santa Barbara Channel because of the interest of the Nixon administration in expanding offshore oil exploration around the country. And this started a whole lot of work in various aspects of the country, not the least of which was the Gulf of Alaska, where there was being about $20 million a year being spent at that time, which is a lot of money. And the reason I mention this is that I went to in 1975, I went to oil spill conference in Seattle, which I understand those conferences are no longer being held. If somebody can correct me if I'm wrong. Every 2 years? Okay. Every 3. Okay, that used to be almost every year, I think. Yeah. those are important conferences. But I went to those conferences and decided, gee, I don't think I want to study oil spills. You don't have any data before. Everything's kind of mushy, and I was coming from being a radio ecology background for a couple of years at Lawrence Livermore Laboratory, and I thought, well, I'll stick with the seeps, but eventually got pulled into writing some reviews on offshore oil effects in the 70s, and when the Exxon Valdez ran aground, a few months later I got calls from the lawyers to try to help out in terms of expert advice. So kind of pulled it in that process. But what I've seen is there's kind of the history of science and spending and the history of publications is kind of lumpy. It was back in the 70s after the Torrey Canyon spill, after the Amoco Cadiz spill, and I think it was 79, and then the Santa Barbara oil spill that took place in 69. There was a lot of emphasis on oil pollution. It was reviewed as one of the major threats to the ocean at the time, and there was a lot of money spent on looking at both spills and also doing toxicology work. So if you look in the toxicology literature and you go back 40 years, there's a tremendous amount done in terms of the toxicology of crude oil, and also some of the other refined oils as well. And then things kind of died down through the 80s until the Valdez happened, and there's another big burst of effort. And I think it's probably happening right now with the results from the Deepwater Horizon spill. And when these big lumps go through the snake, they have effects in terms of how efficiently the money's spent and what kind of graduate students are complete their work and what kind of scientists, track record scientists build up. So it's kind of uneven. And when I worked in radio ecology, it was very apparent to me in the early 70s that if we had a big nuclear accident that like 3 Mile Island, but maybe even more serious somewhere in the country, we really got kind of run out of radio ecologists, that they're not being produced in this country. A little bit more overseas, and Japan has reason to now, I think. But still, they're looking for U.S. expertise in these areas. So there's a lot of information. I've talked a little bit about toxicology. Well, let me start with baseline information. In almost all these oil spills, the scientists that get there don't have enough information about what happened, what the populations were before the oil hit. And I mentioned this in relation to quantitative studies of intertidal ecology, which were very common up and down the Pacific coast in the 70s and 80s. There was a fair amount of information available. We got up into Alaska and Prince William Sound, and you looked at what was available. There was some qualitative stuff in Green Island that was done years before, but nothing in intertidal. So we didn't know what these communities really looked like before the oil hit. We knew generally qualitatively, but not quantitatively. And you can march through every resource that we dealt with, and in nearly every case, we just didn't have enough baseline information. Or another way to put it is a paucity of baseline information actually introduced large uncertainties into the effects that we were documenting. Another area that I think we need to think about, well, before I go there again, relation to baseline population data, I think that the movement to do more ocean observing system and put these things in place is a really, really good thing in terms of this field. Because the ocean observing systems are going to generate data that's going to be useful both historically in understanding conditions and also real time in responding to spills. And moving on to toxicity, as I said, in the 70s, there was a lot of toxicity data, and we have a lot of great papers, particularly on invertebrates. You can look at the toxicity of oil to amphipods or to various kinds of mollusks, jellyfish, you name the invertebrate group, and also fish. A lot of fish work was done in those days. A lot of it was very short term, so that I think there's still a need to do some long-term effects work. The picture for the vertebrates is a lot sketchier. I know in the Valdez we had harbor seals that were being coated with oil. We had sea otters being coated with oil. We have all kinds of seabirds being coated with oil. And we knew hypothermia was a problem because of the cold water with the sea otters and the birds, but we didn't have a really good idea of what the implications were of oil on the coats of seals, or what was if a otter is cleaning itself, grooming its pelage, and ingests oil. What does that really mean? How much oil is toxic to it, and what are the toxic effects? And there wasn't really any information available for most of the vertebrates that were affected. Even with the fish, I showed those slides this morning on pink salmon, and I think people are having to revise their ideas about the toxicity, because back in the 70s, the toxicity of oil to fish was generally in the low parts per million, and people thought was some kind of a threshold there. Well, after the Valdez, and there are people that will argue with me, but we've got good published data, and I think the experiments are very solid, that we have effects in the low parts per billion on herring and pink salmon. So we need to take a little harder look in those areas, and people are doing some of that sort of work. And I think one of the things we could take away from the Deepwater Horizon is we're going into deeper water, and we're down in the mesopelagic and bathypelagic zones of the ocean, and baseline population data was almost non-existent for the Gulf of Mexico in these areas, especially quantitative baseline information, and what species were there and what abundances, and baseline information on the toxicity of oil to these deep water creatures was not very well known, let alone the long-term effects of oil exposure. One of the other issues that I raised this morning was the trying to resolve, or at least deal somehow with the conflicting conclusions that were arrived at by the government scientists, academics, and then industry on the other hand. And a lot of it has to do with not having the sorts of information we need for baseline. A lot of it had to do with standards of proof. A lot of it had to do with interpretations of toxicity and long-term population effects. And I don't know how to resolve these things. Without good baseline data, I think it's really difficult, because if you don't have before, after, and exposed and unexposed as your kind of 4 different treatments, you're not going to arrive at a really rigorous response or conclusion. One of the other things that concerns me is the use of dispersants. I'm not a dispersant expert, but I have been doing some work in the Arctic for Ocean Conservancy, and thinking about what might happen with spills in the Arctic, a much more challenging environment, ice much of the year, the possibility of under ice oil, tremendous extremes in weather, and so forth. And if I'm not a critic of the use of dispersants in the deep water, I just don't want the wrong conclusions to be made by policymakers. I think we need to be honest about what we know about were dispersants effective in undersea application or on the surface? And what's our level of uncertainty about these things? Because I think they're going to be used, and maybe they're already used in the Arctic to argue that, well, there's another reason that we can feel better about a potential spill in the Arctic is we have these dispersants so we know they work. I just don't want that information to be misinterpreted. That's about all I have to say, so thank you for your attention.
Hey, Lucinda. Okay. So, unplug the other one, or you're just gonna speak for notes?
Hello, everybody. Appreciate the opportunity to share my perspective with you all. As you probably have figured out, I'm not Thomas Goldbaugh, and as the last speaker before dinner, I think that's totally appropriate for someone who is a late-breaking addition. So I appreciate this opportunity to be here. By way of my background, and I don't know a lot of you, this is all the front-end superheroes I think I'm talking to here, the people that are like the Navy SEALs, the people that go out there and fix the problem. And I'm a little further down the line. I'm the scientist. And what you hear a lot from scientists is, well, it's complicated. So that's the team that I work with. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit how I think we can approach this problem a little differently. I was trained in chemical oceanography, so I think that some of the earlier comments that Nancy made about interdisciplinary studies are really important. This was back in 1984, and there was really nobody out there doing environmental studies at that time. And coming out of school with an oceanography degree, which is amazingly interdisciplinary, was a really powerful background to have. So I think it's great that students at this university are getting that opportunity to learn those skill sets. I also had a really interesting background with relating to both of these two spills. I actually came into the Exxon Valdez oil spill about 15 years after the spill, and for that effort, I was working for the Trustee Council. So I was hired originally by the state of Alaska, and then I ended up working for NOAA. And Bob has mentioned how contentious things were on the Exxon Valdez spill between the government scientists and the Exxon scientists. I was brought in to synthesize some of that information and pull it together to do an independent assessment of lingering oil and that potential risks of lingering oil to resources, and also to take a fresh look at the condition of the injured resources. So I came into the Exxon Valdez oil spill, or EVOS, late. I came into Deepwater Horizon a little earlier. I have been retained by British Petroleum, so I work for BP. So I have kind of seen these oil spills from a couple different angles. And I think science kind of anchors and centralizes us in our ability to think about the issues related to these spills. So I think just to touch on Deepwater briefly, it's been one of the most thoroughly studied spills and ecosystems ever. There's a huge amount of data out there, and a lot of that data is publicly available now and available to academia. So there's a lot of data that can be reviewed independently. I think we've learned a lot of things just in what we've learned to date about the Gulf, and also the contrast between Exxon Valdez and the Gulf. And I'm really happy to see Jackie Michelle here, because I really read your paper carefully about the contrast. And I think what's remarkable, and kind of helps us ground us from a really practical perspective, is that it turns out that the oil shoreline for EVOS was actually longer than the oil shoreline for the Gulf of Mexico following Deepwater. And I think that's pretty remarkable. And I think that's a testament to the phenomenal efforts of a lot of the people in this room. And it's also a circumstance of the nature of the oil that was released in EVOS versus the Deepwater Horizon incident. So just to touch a little bit on what role science plays in all of this. Science, of course, brings objectivity, rigor, and focus. And I think that the area where data collected during the spill becomes really important is as the starting point for thinking about exposure. So for example, the SCAT teams have really developed their techniques for looking at oil shorelines, and that's a really good starting point for thinking about what shoreline resources might be exposed. But there's a huge amount of data that were collected to help guide the response decisions in the open ocean. The Operational Science Advisory Team played a big role in directing water column samples, sediment samples. We saw some of those beautiful sediment profile images earlier from Steve that really give us a visual image of what was going on, particularly near the wellhead. So that data is a really powerful starting point for thinking about exposure. And I think exposure is really the first step to thinking about how we need to frame the environmental issues related to any oil spill or any environmental problem in the first place. And we need to think about them, I think, as links in a chain. First, we have the release. That leads to exposure of a certain amount of organisms or resources. And where those elevated concentrations are guides our thinking on who might be exposed and to what extent and to what levels. And then the next question you ask is, are there effects at that level? And then finally, do those effects at individual levels translate to population level effects? So I think if we can think about those as links in a chain, and it's where all the science comes to bear when we're thinking about resources and injury and damages related to oil spills. I think when you think about it too, there's a really important role for laboratory studies in all of this, but you need to think carefully about how those laboratory studies translate to the environment. And an earlier speaker talked a little bit about how the media would grab a soundbite from a paper and run with it. And I think it's really important to recognize that the laboratory studies have to be considered in terms of their implications in the field. They're really powerful tools for helping us to understand what kind of effects might exist related to exposure to oil constituents and at what levels you might have concerns. But the first question you ask when you look at laboratory data is, how does that translate to the environment? Where do we see those concentrations? Over what area? What resources might be exposed to them? So I think that's a really important part in thinking about how those laboratory studies translate to the environment, because I'm sure we've all seen some really dramatic headlines about a lab study X, Y, or Z, and when you think about it, that laboratory study was really good in and of itself, but it doesn't mean that tuna are dying all over the place. So we need to think carefully about how we translate and how we interpret some of this data. So I think you've heard a lot of input recently about what's really important when we move more into the hardcore science phase of all this. Baseline is really important. What were conditions before the spill? And everybody agrees that we need to get better at assessing that. But I think also natural variability. Gary Shigenaka mentioned the Pacific Decadal Oscillation earlier today, and that's something we're dealing with in Seattle, where I live, and the nutrient loading over the sills into Puget Sound. So to the extent that we can understand some of this natural variability and tease it out from the impacts of some of these other stressors, I think we'll come a long way toward better understanding the actual environmental impacts of a spill or any other kind of environmental problem. I mentioned the issue with the laboratory studies and thinking hard about how they actually relate to the environment. I think also what has turned out to be really important, and I defer to Jackie on probably all of this, is how does the site or the oil-specific conditions translate to impacts? And if you look at EVOS and Exxon and Deepwater side by side, you see some of the contrasts that were described earlier. We're looking at heavy oil, near shore location, phenomenally sensitive habitat, cold, worst time of the year to happen, and then a storm came. And with Deepwater, really prolonged, different kind of oil, lighter weight, more readily degraded, a naturally acclimated microbial community, but a lot bigger than EVOS. So thinking about those two aspects of those two spills and how they translate to what actually happened is really important. And a systematic framing of the problem with a conceptual model, I think, is really important. The other things to think about are the effectiveness of physical and chemical processes and the role that surfactants played in all of this. I think that was a part of the story in the Exxon Valdez. I'm going to mix those up, in the Deepwater incident. And I mentioned the microbial processes, which are being really carefully studied in the Gulf, and climate and temperature. Things happen faster when it's warm. So I think when we frame the problems, we can factor in all of these considerations as we try and understand what we're seeing and interpret what might happen. Another aspect that you don't hear much about, but I think is really important, and I've got a few examples of it, are factors related to ecosystem or biological resilience. It's amazing what we can do to the environment as humans, and it just seems to bounce back pretty effectively. A perfect example, and some of these mechanisms that I think are worth noting, are avoidance. We know from studies that have been done on the dead zone in the Gulf of Mexico that I think was about the size of Connecticut this year, that shrimp and fish can avoid that low oxygen environment. We know that vertebrates, birds and fish, can metabolize PAHs and eliminate them. Not so much bivalves, so bivalves are great indicators of exposure. I think that, well, I mentioned the acclimation of the bacteria. I think also life history characteristics are really important, and they help inform our understanding of how a specific resource might react. So for example, something like plankton that has rapid population turnover might rebound more quickly. Fish or species that have multiple year classes that spawn together, like tuna and mai, are going to have more resilience because the year that was hit by the spill is going to be breeding in subsequent years with other age classes. Some of these species have high fecundity, dietary plasticity, and I'm only talking about the characteristics of some of these resources that make them more resilient, not the characteristics that make them more sensitive. But these are things to keep in mind. I also think it's worth thinking a little bit about the species and their resilience to disturbance. We manage our fisheries based on this perspective. We have a maximum sustainable yield for our fisheries. We know we can take a certain amount of fish out of the system and still have a healthy population. So that resiliency to disturbance is something we use when we manage our fisheries. So just to recap what we've learned, I think people with more expertise than me have pointed out that fast response is critical. I think it's really important to recognize that interdisciplinary science teams work best. These types of impacts have a physical oceanography, a chemistry component, a toxicology component, and of course, centrally a biological component that we need to understand. I mentioned earlier this university is a good example for producing people that can address those issues. I think one of the major things we've learned, and it was alluded to earlier, is that aggressive removal in sensitive habitats is not always appropriate. And we know from the hot water washing in Prince William Sound that there are times when you don't aggressively remove oil or any contaminant. And natural recovery has been integrated into environmental problem solving for quite some time now. And what we saw in the Gulf was a limited amount of aggressive removal actions in the marshes. So that makes the marshes a perfect example for evaluating the successfulness of natural recovery. So I think that was a valuable lesson. We've learned it not only in EVOS, but in subsequent environmental studies. I think the other theme that I've heard mentioned and that I think we're all very aware of is net environmental benefits. There were some tough decisions made in applying dispersants, and there can be arguments about whether that was appropriate or not. But the end result was we have a protected shoreline, and I think I heard earlier comments about human health concerns that I hadn't heard previously about VOCs reaching the surface. Another important thing then, just to keep in mind, and this I learned from working on EVOS, because we came in to look at the status of the resources. And one of the things that had happened on EVOS was that the recovery objectives were locked in. So we could only evaluate the resources in terms of their recovery objectives. Well, since those recovery objectives were set, we learned a lot about the environment. We learned a lot about year-to-year variability, impact on resources. You know, things don't stay the same. So I think carefully crafting recovery objectives so that they're, you know, reasonable in the frame of what we know about environmental variability and other stressors is really important. Each spill is unique. I think everybody in the room has probably said that. And I think it's important to frame the problem appropriately, to really think through the issues you're dealing with, what's different about it, where the release was, who might get exposed to it. And that doesn't always happen, particularly when very focused studies are getting translated to the public from a larger perspective. That's all I have.
Great. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, well, thank you very much to our great panelists for their opening remarks. And we have a number of wonderful questions that have come in from you, the wonderful audience. I have managed to collate a number of them that came in on the same theme into one very sort of long question that I'm going to pose to the panel. If we had been playing audience bingo on and someone had had the term baseline data on their card, they would clearly have covered that space many times because many of the speakers brought up the issue of baseline data, either the importance of getting it or proposals for collecting it or whatever. So the question I'd like to pose to the panel is as follows. It's a three-part question. First of all, given the fact that baseline data is so important, where are we in getting it for the Arctic, since everyone recognizes that the Arctic is not very well sampled and yet is perhaps ground zero for our next area of concern? Secondly, how practical is it that we're going to get someone to pay for it? There have been proposals that maybe industry might do it as a cost of doing business. And third, when we gather baseline data, are we doing it in a manner that is appropriate for factoring in natural and unnatural variability on interannual, decadal, and variability, and also trends such as climate change and other anthropogenic impacts? For example, we just had dead zones brought up. So, who wants to start? I think Steve wants to start.
You said it.
And then we'll go to Bob.
So on the Arctic, so one of my last duties at NOAA was sitting in on a meeting with Shell, and they were trying to get their permits, and Dave is shaking his head. He was in the meeting, I think, as well. And, you know, honestly, Shell has done a lot of work up there, you know, and the issue there, of course, is that they want to drill in the same place that the bowhead whales come in, and the hunters want to hunt them at the same time that they want to drill, and it's a very difficult situation. I think we know a lot about what's going on there with a lot of those resources because of the baseline studies that Shell and other people have done. What I would say is that, and this is my own comment, that I think the environmental standards for the allowing of drilling in the Arctic are much higher than the environmental standards right now for continued operations in the Gulf of Mexico. And I think this gets to maybe one of the earlier comments about, you know, have we written off the Gulf a little bit in terms of a working waterfront. Second question on, I think we've got some data on Arctic. What we don't probably have very well is a good toxicology database, although there have been some studies commissioned on toxicology, particularly in marine mammals, which is good. In terms of who pays for it, I mean, I always thought it was polluter pays. You know, that you know, there's a price of doing business here. And there was a very cogent comment this morning that said, and I can't remember who said it, was, we're not going to do anything we're not required to do. And so if, you know, that's the easiest way around here, then we need to rethink this, not only from the industry's point of view of being good citizens, but what's the regulatory environment? You know, can we actually make these regulations not in law? And I would bet we could if there's a political expediency to do it. Now, the interesting thing is, of course, you know, there's a bunch of academics like Chris and I running around doing all kinds of cool stuff. And we are actually creating a pretty good baseline for a lot of the things that we're doing here. You know, we've sampled a lot of fish in the northern Gulf of Mexico, and, you know, if we keep going, maybe we'll get more. So in some sense, we've actually trapped a pretty nice baseline. But it's not comprehensive, you know. I mean, we don't have anything really in terms of the majority of the Gulf of Mexico, which is actually not in the United States. And then, you know, our studies are focused in the northern Gulf of Mexico, not in the west. So I think we could blend baselines that we're creating with all this money with other things. And then the last issue, natural variability, that's a good one. Obviously, there's a lot of monitoring in place that looks at the natural variability of components of the ecosystem, like natural variability of fishes and marine mammals, just because, you know, they're subject to other regulatory regimes. The natural variability and the natural inputs on the toxicology, however, are things we should get a handle on, because, you know, that's going to set the baseline for, you know, any knock-on effects of something like that. The abundance of things, I mean, it's clear in Mearns Rock. You know, a lot of things influence the abundance of things, but there's only so many things that influence the toxicology of things, and I think you can get a pretty good fingerprint on them.
Okay, yeah, Bob.
I just might add a few things. Is my microphone on? Hello? Yeah, there. I just might add a couple comments. I did a little work for Ocean Conservancy on the Arctic, and a couple of points. There's a lot more data than most people think there is, but it's not really synthesized. And also, we've set up some of our institutions in a manner that I don't think is ideal from the scientific point of view. And I don't mean to criticize Mineral Management Service, because they have done even more work than Shell has. For instance, in the Chukchi Sea, though Shell is doing and has done a tremendous amount of work in the Chukchi Sea. But Minerals Management has done quite a bit over the years, except that they don't take on long-term monitoring, and not many of our institutions do take on long-term monitoring. So trying to provide up-to-date information or a long data stream with which you can start to interpret natural variability in the system due to all kinds of things, I would think that the industry would be pushing for this sort of thing, because if there's baseline data on some population of animals that was taken in 1995, or going back to OXSEEP, which was this large program on the Outer Continental Shelf in the 70s, seabird data, for instance, and there's a spill and there's a lot of seabirds killed, and we go back and look at that. Well, what was it like before the spill? Well, we had seabird data from some of the rookeries in on the edge of the Chukchi Sea, and it showed so-and-so, and then things have changed in the interceding decades, and we have a lot fewer seabirds. How do you sort out the effects of the spill, which we know are pretty deadly to seabirds, from the effects that have gone on due to warming climate? And maybe, and I think that's a quite reasonable sort of scenario to worry about. So I would think that industry would be behind this, and I think we need to think about finding ways to put pressure on the federal government to orient the way they do business and hand out money to monitor ecosystems, so that they're more oriented towards long-term spending. to Minerals Management Service, a 5-year project's a long project. And that's just not the scale on which things change in the ocean.
Yeah, the only thing that I would add is, I don't know if it's on or not, but it's on, great, it has to do with the variability. And that tied with many of these systems that we're talking about in some of the populations are very widely distributed. And even some of the work that, I remember a lot of the work that Gary and Jackie Michelle did, and I was doing the chemistry for in Prince William Sound. High variability in the data. And so when you have high variability in the environment that you're sampling, that requires you to take a much larger number of samples to get the data that you would need with the confidence factors to make these determinations as far as baseline to look at changes. And then when you factor that into the fact that it's a very big world out there, it's huge. So I'm kind of falling back on what Bob was saying. I think what we need to do is look at doing all this level of work specifically for baseline for oil spills probably will never get funded. But tying in the type of information that would be of value and also support spills with other research so that there's more connections to the communities doing it, kind of like Chris was talking about where we have that interaction so that we can build upon other research, has a greater chance of providing more baseline data in the future. But we will never get all the baseline data we need. It's just too big of a world. So we need to try to maximize where those dollars are being spent, where maybe the data that is being collected with slight changes would be of value to the response community as well and damage assessment community as well. So that's all I have to add.
Lucinda?
Yeah, I have a couple of thoughts, and this will be quick. Chemistry's easy, biology's hard. We can easily collect chemistry data and collect representative chemistry data, but the Arctic's going to be probably the most sensitive environment there is to varying resource responses to climate change. So I think that's something we just need to be aware of. The other thing too, though, and I've heard a little bit at this in these sessions, is remote sensing, both with subsurface sensors and by trying to anchor satellite data to what we're seeing on the surface. I think there's efficient ways we need to think about it. I don't have the answers to it, but I think we're starting to see some glimmers there.
Thanks. Okay, I love this next question. I want to see people squirm up here. Okay. Are academics biased to finding effects because of the difficulty of publishing null studies?
No. I hope not. I think a good scientist who went to an exposed area and found a bug that was doing pretty well would be even more excited about that. I would ask, how did that bug last that uninvited guest and how did it process it? So I think sometimes it might not be as exciting to say gotcha to the spiller, but in some respects you'd like to celebrate how nature made it through this gauntlet of oil.
Okay, I will completely agree with you that in the case of a major disaster, the fact that there was resilience in nature would be publishable. But I will also say Science did just publish a paper with the title something about the file drawer effect, which has been documented in the social sciences. And the file drawer effect is something of the following. Let's suppose you have a study that had 20 subjects, and 15 didn't show the effect, 5 did. Well, you would say, oh, it's a null effect, so you wouldn't publish it. Someone else redoes the study, same effect, they don't publish it. Then someone else does the study, and they find 12 do show the effect and 8 don't. They suddenly get that published, but if they pooled their data with the two that had the null study, suddenly their positive gains are completely negated by the two studies that are in the file drawer that didn't get published. So what was being argued in this is that given that now there are so many journals, so many open access journals like PLOS One, that will publish any paper that meets minimum quality criteria, that more people should publish even negative findings, just so that file drawer effect doesn't happen. Steve, you want to say something?
Well, let me tell you a story about a paper I tried to publish in Science Magazine. Let's just say it got published someplace else, but part of it was
I'm sure it got published in a
perfectly wonderful journal, yes. And one of the comments
This was before my time.
Well, it was actually, yes, it was. One of the comments I got back from the editor reminded me that it was paraphrasing the comment, was people like to watch a good traffic accident, and when cars avoid each other, it doesn't necessarily get the impact factor, and so I think part of the comments back were you're not really finding this significant effect, and so I think there is some of that. I don't think it's the academics per se. I think it's many of the things that Chris talked about in his talk, and that is the impact factor of these large journals and other things. What are the academic positives you get, and that's publishing in these prestigious journals. And so obviously motivation there is to explain phenomena in creative ways, and find things that negative results. Sure, they're publishable, but I think they're publishable in sort of the broader areas, and they don't make that kind of impact.
But in any case, it all has to pass peer review, and the scrutiny is always there.
I just want to make sure that this is not a question of ethics, right? I mean, this is a question of the scientific system per se, and so I tend to hope that ethically we would do what's right and not try to cherry pick, if it bleeds, it leads, as opposed to trying to do good science.
Yes, and I think the sense of the one I said that was the file drawer effect is simply it's a bias in the system as to what makes it through to publication is the one that just, of the three studies, the one that showed the positive effect was the one that got published, and the two that showed the negative effect didn't get published. If all three were published, then it would be clear that, it's really a negative effect, and the errant effect was the study that showed the positive effect. Right, exactly. So I think now that there are journals that are publishing negative effects, this is less likely to happen. Bob?
I think a corollary of this is when their studies are published and come up with perfectly what appear to be statistically valid results, some kind of positive effect that reinforces the hypothesis is published, but it's never repeated. And my understanding of reading, I think it was an article in Science, is that this thing is a lot more common than, embarrassingly common, I think, particularly in biomedical science, where these things are maybe later repeated and found a huge percentage, a very significant percentage of work cannot be repeated. Yeah.
I think that, Bob, you raise a good point, because there are basically, in my view, several types of science. There is the laboratory science in which the conditions can be exactly repeated, and reproducibility can be raised to a gold standard where one can reproduce the experiment ab initio by starting from scratch and duplicating every step of the experiment to show whether the result is valid or not. That's one class of experiment. but you can imagine many things many scientific results that might have occurred during Deepwater Horizon, which was a transient event, that there is no way to recreate some of the experiments that, for example, Chris did, because the ocean will never dial back to exactly the way it was during Deepwater Horizon. And the best you can say is to make the data available in a public place where anyone can go and say, okay, what instrument did you use? What were the calibration coefficients? What's the data? Can I analyze that data and get the same results? That's the best you can hope for. And it's not the same gold standard that you might hope for in a laboratory, but you know, it's the best we can do in the environmental sciences.
Agree?
I mean,
You wrote an editorial on that.
I mean, electrons are free, right? I mean, the supplemental information is the greatest thing that's happened to us in academia recently, because we can put so much content in there. So it's great.
Okay, next question. This one for a larger group discussion. The National Academy concluded that ecological services is how the effect of Deepwater Horizon should be evaluated. What does the panel think of that measure of impact? Does the panel have an opinion?
Well,
Yeah, Charlie, this is yours.
yeah. Well, and I should preface that I'm normally involved in the front end of response and not so much on the damage assessment side. But, you know, I think we look at restoring the environment to its functional equivalence of what those services were that were provided. And they're not only associated directly with the ecosystem, but often how we interact and use that ecosystem. Like, for example, recreational fisheries does qualify as part of a lost services. But I think to say that it's solely based on, to hear what you say is that, you know, to look at the injury based solely on ecological services is a very functional way to look at it, but and it's maybe pretty much the way the law is written, because it's in-kind mitigation along those same ways. But I think there's much more to those ecosystems from the impact of a spill, more than just how they function. And a lot of it could be just lost in terminology, because eco-service is a very broad term to me.
Well, let me ask you this maybe. Do we know all the ecological services that the Gulf supplies, such that we can truly value all of those services? And secondly, do we know how to appropriately value all those services in order to, for example, know that when we've done a tit for tat?
Oh, that's the easy answer. Yeah, and of course we don't know all of them. But there's ones that are selected when what I was referring to in the process that have value. But I'm going to let Steve jump into this one.
So, Truth in Advertising, I actually wrote the terms of reference for that study. And the $1 million that it costs actually passed through my office, but nevertheless. I think ecological services as a lens for this is useful to a certain extent. And as Charlie said, some services can be quantified relatively well, like the provisioning services. You know, we know what we get from oil and gas out of the system. We know what we get for fish. We know the importance of transportation, et cetera. Things like supporting services are extremely difficult, and they're knowing the interactions between all the things that go on in the Gulf that, abate hypoxia and do all these things. Knowing all the functional links in those chains is going to be very difficult to do. So I think in some sense we can get some early lens in the things that we know how to count, but the things that are process oriented are just going to be much more difficult for us to quantify.
Anyone else? Go ahead, Lucinda.
Yeah, I have just one comment, and that is that it's almost a philosophical question. You know, ecological services is very human-centric, and that's the way it's written.
Okay, next question. I also love this question. We heard about the challenge of coordinating response operations and public communications when the federal coordinators are trying to coordinate with the state and local officials. So, what about the scientists here? Do the federal and nationally recognized scientists coordinate well with state and local scientists successfully? And if so, how do they do it? So, scientists?
I haven't interacted with I must admit that I have no answer. I don't know what I expect that you reach out, you call who you know, especially during a crisis and during an oil spill. You often call who you know. I mean, I don't know if a comment on Alan is still here, but it's very much, you don't exchange business cards at a crisis. So I suspect that if you want to be more successful at a regional level, then you would already develop that pre-existing relationship. But I'm not quite sure what the vehicle is right now. And I'm a carpetbagger when I studied the Deepwater Horizon, living in Cape Cod.
So yeah, this was a really interesting aspect of the spill, and as Chris has pointed out, it's absolutely unique that academics have become first responders, or at least mix that role, and that wasn't anticipated, and certainly I don't think was the case in terms of Exxon Valdez, that the local academic community got. I'm sure they got involved in it eventually, particularly as they got contracted to do things, but people going out and collecting baseline data was very unique. And what we found was that there was a growing level of frustration that, those of us in the federal, science domain weren't out there beating the bushes, spending a lot of time with people. And so people, Chris pointed this out, where's the command and control, on the academic side? And it was something that it got some legs eventually. I remember we conducted 3 public meetings with local academic groups, and I remember one of them was in a church, which was probably pretty good because it kept the language down a little bit. But there was a heightened level of frustration that where is the money? Where's the coordination of all the science? And frankly, most of the people on the federal side were running around with their tongues hanging out, trying to cover all these issues, and there just wasn't a mechanism set up. I do think that in the intervening period of time, you've seen the groups like GOMERC, which is basically this collaboration of about 60 academic institutions get stood up so that it actually would be a point of contact. And I think the next time around, which hopefully that won't be as bad, there actually will be some point of contact that you could actually make this thing work a little bit more easily as long as you had resources.
I was going to say Consortium for Ocean Leadership was a huge help in connecting people from outside the region with people inside the region, and those universities which are members of Consortium for Ocean Leadership, and there was a Gulf of Mexico consortium member, were very helpful in connecting me, for example, with people in the region. Yeah. Go ahead, Bob.
I just might say that, not to be too cynical, but the next time there's a large oil spill, I guarantee you that you'll develop a plethora of local experts as the money starts to flow, looking into effects. Yeah.
And I'll add to Steve's comment, because when we had those public meetings and the frustration for a lot of people we talked to, a lot of folks, when we go to these groups and pull in scientists and researchers from a variety of universities at central locations for those 3 meetings. But I think they had the understanding that we weren't giving them money for whatever reason, when the reality is the response community, unless it's the industry side of the coin, but the federal side of the coin under the Oil Liability Trust Fund and OPA 90, cannot fund research for oil removal, unless I'm wrong, Jim and others. But so we don't have those monies. And I don't think that's well understood. So you have to have a mechanism to have those monies, and then you have to have the coordination. But we cannot fund research as part of the oil removal. And that ties our hands often when one of our, being a scientist that's involved in emergency response, when we try to learn so we can apply what we learned to the next spill, sometimes we don't have that ability ourselves even to do it without these funding sources. So.
Okay, I'm going to paraphrase this next one a little differently. In Chris's talk, we heard a lot about how the academic culture is focused on the importance of publishing and on promotion, and that places certain pressures on the academics in anything they're involved in something that's going to result in an interesting science result. And yet, from the standpoint of the industry and the government people involved in the oil spill, they have a certain issues of concern to the responders that are, top on their list, dealing with cleanup of the oil in an efficient way, capping the well safely, collecting the oil most efficiently, and knowing how to do that well. So the question is, how do we find a way to, if academics want to get involved, to focus them on a problem that will actually help the responders without shutting the door to the possibility that they're going to find something that the responders maybe should have been looking at, the possibility of a eureka moment. So how do we work that interface?
I think the new rules apply. I mean, I think you have to recognize that some good science that you have to do in a crisis is just good science, but it may not get you the Nobel Prize. I mean, I think that's one of the first new rules in place, is that an academic's role during a crisis is not necessarily the same as status quo. But on the flip side, it would be sad to see scientists only work on the wish list that was put out by the response, because it would quell the possibility of the curiosity and the other backdrops and experiences that scientists could bring to bear. So I think you'd want a balanced portfolio of science that was addressing the response's needs versus what a scientist who has pretty good insight could bring to the table.
But how do you choose the science that is in that latter category, given all the people that would want to have a crack at it, and given that there are very, very limited resources, not only funding, but also in access to the site?
I already answered. So.
Let me make a few comments here. I do think the issue of incentives is really important, and honestly, I guess I'm maybe a little bit less cynical than Chris. I do think that the major motivation of the academics was quite altruistic. People wanted to help.
Well, the people on the flow rate group definitely.
Yeah.
They all just wanted to.
That being said, it's interesting because a lot of
No, I don't think I'm a cynic.
no. All right, maybe that was too strong. So what we did see is I would say academics at the periphery trying to be relevant, and there were some colossal failures of, for example, some models, right, that were run by certain groups, and you talked about UCAR's model of this stuff getting halfway to Ireland, and I got called to Barbara Mikulski's office, and she wanted to know when the oil was going to end up in Chesapeake Bay, and was very angry about it, and then also in terms of the deep plumes, there was a GFDL model that said that there would be a major anoxic event, which never happened. I mean, and so you got people running really good models, but they're not quite, in the community, and so I think we need to be a little bit selective about making sure that people have the intellectual oomph, if they're going to work on these problems, and we're going to subsidize it, that they actually have the tools to do that, and so I do think that in some sense, crowdsourcing the problems, laying out our wish list out there, and then maybe getting other people to help fund it, and I think those would be really helpful. And then trying to work in some kind of atmosphere where if you got some people with newer, innovative ways to look at things, they get tempered by people that have been in this community a little bit. Right?
Yeah, that's interesting. Anyone else want to weigh in on this one?
I have one quick thought, yeah, and this is more general than anything, but you know, the reason that I have a job as an environmental consultant is that I understand deadlines and I understand issues, and there's a big difference sometimes with academics where, you know, answering the question and getting the, you know, the deadline met is different. It's outside the academic culture, and I think that is a relevant point to this topic.
Okay, next question. What should be the appropriate balance during a disaster like this of depending on tried and true technologies versus vetting new approaches? For example, using dispersants at great depth when that had not been tried before, or you can imagine bringing in some new skimming technologies and other things. Should an event like this be used as a laboratory, or is that inappropriate? What do people think?
Well,
Charlie.
Deepwater Horizon is a very unusual event in that for 3 months it was a new oil spill every day. Most incidents that we would respond to would not have that period of time to even consider a lot of new technologies because you wouldn't have the opportunity. The window would be missed before you could implement them. So you end up using tried and true. So in many ways, the Deepwater Horizon did become kind of this laboratory. And there was a lot of effort done by several groups, including the arts group within the Unified Command and even at the NIC level, to evaluate new technologies and new approaches from everything from source control to cleanup to alternative ways to enhance recovery of this oil. And there was a lot of work vetting through those proposals, and some of them were implemented because the window was available, and some of them were successful, and some of them weren't. So if the opportunity is there, there is the opportunity to try new tools that may fit that specific incident. But on most spills, the window will be over before you can consider it. You got to use the tried and true equipment that you pre-staged and is available. And at the same time, while the Deepwater was very unusual in that the subsea dispersant was definitely a novel, it was something that we did not do much planning for. It was one that looked from the initial reviews like there was enough benefit to continue that. And that's what you have to make a determination. And sometimes I think that the information is available to do that, sometimes it's not. So Deepwater's an anomaly though.
Right.
Yeah.
Steve?
Yeah, I do think necessity is the mother of invention sometime, and I think I go back to monitoring this plume and the technology that generally was accepted was Niskin bottles and a CTD. Well, I mean, it's really hard to get some kind of situational awareness when you got to send all that to a lab and come back. And then of course Hui brought out their Sentry underwater vehicle that had a underwater GCMS, and you could actually image this virtually in real time. And so I think in that sense, it really was an important technology. The problem is a lot of the traditional people that were used to looking at these data really had no experience with that type of technology, so it wasn't well accepted. And so if I could redo this, I knew SRI had a GCMS, and they were telling me about it. I should have probably said, look, we're going to do it. So I think it really depends on the circumstance, right?
No, it really was. And we looked early on, some of the initial tests on the subsurface was with acoustic, Doppler type equipment. We looked at fluorometry equipment, but that got confusing because a lot of the readily available equipment that could be used at deep water didn't have really the excitation in absorbance wavelengths, so we'd really want to target oil more selectively. So because this was done in kind of this experimental design without being pre-planned, we made do with equipment was available, and through the process added better equipment as it became available and coordinated with groups that had better equipment. And so it was a learning curve. But you have to do that. That's actually the nature of emergency response. Emergency response, you have to be adaptive. And we've always been that way, because the worst thing that you can do is say, we might have tried if I only had the perfect instrument. You know, you have to work with what you have, and you have to develop the approach that you need. Key is you have to understand where the gaps are because of the tool that's used. You have to understand that barometer well enough to know what may be the background, what are the matrix effects, what is my true sensitivity, and what am I really measuring because it wasn't specifically adapted for that purpose. And you may not learn that till after the fact when you do studies in a swimming pool somewhere, which was done. Yeah.
Okay, go ahead.
I just might say, not in the response mode, but in the restoration program from the Valdez, we had the luxury of being able to fund a number of different approaches to a problem in many cases. And it was really an opportunity to kind of move spill science ahead by using, not only tried and true that'll give you the best answer you can, but maybe something experimental that might give you a better answer, or maybe you don't have anything that gives you an answer that you can be certain of, but there may be something that somebody proposes that might work. And so using a spectrum of these kind of approaches, I think, probably pushes the spill science ahead.
Okay, next question. I'm going to sort of lump two together here because they both relate to dispersants. First, what was the application rate of deep sea dispersant, and what is the probability that the dispersant even penetrated the wall of oil blasting to the surface? And is there ongoing work to better understand the efficacy of deep water application of dispersants?
That's a good question. Steve, what was the? No, I actually don't remember how many gallons per hour we could inject, but I know we had an upper limit that was imposed on us. We were scaling it up, and we reached a point we could not do more than, I think it was 5,000 gallons per day or something. I'd have to go back and look. It's not.
So,
I'm sorry? It was 15,000 gallons a day.
Yeah.
And so,
And I think it also changed depending on how much the collection was. So as the collection ramped up, the amount of dispersant ramped down.
So, and I just don't have that in front of me, but those numbers are available, what the rates were. And we did that. One of the things we did early on is we were taking these baby steps to look at this approach. And it was very difficult to do good science with this kind of novel technique that far below the sea, and you couldn't see it except with using an ROV. But we did look at different ways of applying the dispersant through a hose, or then later through some type of tube that had better distribution directly into the riser, how far we needed to be in the riser to look at the effects, and making those monitoring observations using tools that were not specifically developed, but we were adapting, like acoustic Doppler and other devices, and looking at surface expression. We know that there was some mixing. What we don't know is just how effective it truly was. And we do know from the research that was done post-event, like some of the work done by Per Dalling and others, the high temperature and the velocity of that gas actually probably enhanced the rate of the interaction. Because one of our biggest concerns was that resonance time on contact time, that you would have true contact between the dispersant and the oil itself to reduce that surface tension. But some of the laboratory studies were done seemed to suggest that it was probably effective. And the anecdotal data, which I don't call hard science data, seems to suggest that also. When we have monitoring data in the field, that there again is a lot of variability in whether it's successful or not. What you really need to do to be able to really know how this will work, because it is being viewed as such a strong or important tool for the future, is you have to really get the true answer, you would have to be able to do a actual release in the environment under simulated conditions and actually study it, and that's not going to happen. That's why Steve said they're doing some work looking at simulating that environment the best you can in a pressurized chamber. But there'll even be questions with that because of the rise. We won't be able to look at the transport. We might look at the interaction between the droplets, but we won't really know the transport. And so there'll still always be answers unless we can do an actual controlled experiment with known amounts of oil and known mixing environments. And the chance of that happening in U.S. waters is probably low. It's a chance it may happen in other countries that are looking at the deep water issue and can do that. Norway, for example. Yeah.
And what about current work on dispersants? It's just the pressure.
Is Kevin Short, somebody could correct me from the Gulf of Mexico Research Initiative, but I believe one of the consortia that was funded out of Tulane is all directed towards dispersant science. So there is a significant amount of money and effort and direction in considering dispersant science.
Okay,
Right.
and looking
And
at
I'd just add to that,
biological.
even within NOAA, I think we have a significant program that we're looking at on trying to fill gaps on some of the dispersant research. So I think there is ongoing work on, quote, dispersants, but it's hard to mimic the subsea type work, and I think that's where some bigger questions exist. Yeah.
Okay.
Can I add
Yeah,
just a
go
little bit?
ahead.
So one of the interesting things is there is a biomarker for dispersants, this so-called DOS chemical, and actually it might be worthwhile to go back to some of the archived oil samples that we've got to see if that's a tracer, that we can account for subsurface oil that has the DOS biomarker. And I know that some of that work's been done, and also you can find some of that DOS in the sediment, oil samples that we've got around the region. So.
Yeah, there's a recent paper that just found some dispersant compounds in beach sand patties, which is noteworthy. But I think what was missed in a lot of the press was that the relative amount of these dispersant compounds relative to the amount of oil that was in these samples is lower. That is, that pound for pound, the dispersants were less likely to persist on the time scales of years than the oil itself.
Okay, thanks, everyone. This next question was specifically directed at you, Chris.
Great.
To comment on the actionable peer review process that I mentioned, the fear of making a mistake.
Mistakes are good, actually, for science, but I think at the end of the day, this goes back to new rules in play. I mean, at the end of the day, if you want us to be more effective, then we have to outline new rules and procedures that protect scientists and also motivate us to do better. This way, there is no great motivation to give data away to somebody you don't know who's going to interpret it and potentially tarnish your career. So I think if you want to move forward, you want to get that machinery lubricated, you want to start moving forward, they have to set a set of new rules in place that recognizes that uncertainty, timescales, memory effects, and all these things in play are different during a crisis. We all recognize that times are different in a crisis. It should be the same thing for academia.
Anyone else want to comment on that one?
I think there were many occasions where scientists forgot the scientific method during the spill in terms of, that you actually do the peer review first and not in the newspapers. And I think, things are self-correcting and all those things, but they do undermine the credibility not only of the overall response, but also the individual scientists. And I think we have to be very sanguine about this, that it really saves everybody's hide to, take a breath, maybe not go to that reporter and maybe, send it around. Maybe, as you and I wrote, a while ago, that, maybe we should come up with some sort of a clearinghouse peer review process, for these highly impactful statements. Right?
Yep, I agree. All right. Okay, so this is the last question that I have not yet covered, and that is, given the U.S. regulatory framework and OSLTF, which is the Oil Spill Liability Trust Fund. I was tripping over the L there. which prohibits funding research during response. How does the panel suggest that scientific involvement be funded during preparedness and response? Yeah, boy, stumped them on this one.
This is a discussion for tomorrow. I mean, if we recognize that there's a need, then we have to build a system in place in which that you bring into play and you turn over the crank more than just once every 15 years. I mean, this is tomorrow's job, I think. You know, how do you do this effectively, and how do you make it so it's streamlined?
Well, I think different potential sources of oil will affect what you might argue is a legitimate source, and I always feel, and maybe this is because I'm from Louisiana, we've always felt that we didn't get enough money for the oil and gas productions on the continental shelf. But I think that part of the cost of doing business in our backyards, like for example, the Gulf of Mexico for the outer continental shelf oil and gas and deep water development, since the risks are there to those states that bordering it, a percentage of those funds generated from those leases should go into researching consequences as part of the cost of doing business. And I think that always over the time, less of that has gone into those type of activities and has gone into other places. So, and I don't have the data in front of me, I'd have to go back, but I remember when I was at the university at LSU, the numbers were pretty staggering on how much money was coming out of the Gulf for oil and gas production and how much was actually being spent on research in the Gulf. It was very, very minor.
So, BOEM has an environmental studies program, and it's funded at $30 million a year, and that's for all the environmental aspects of oil and gas development. And they spend a lot of money on acoustic and seismic research and other things that, and as Charlie said, I mean, what's the numerator over the denominator here in terms of what the industry's generating? That studies program needs to be expanded dramatically, and it should be partially funded by, the royalties the government's collecting. I mean, they're already collecting the money, so why should we plow it back in?
Okay. Anyone else want to comment? Yeah, go
Yeah,
ahead.
yeah, I had a few thoughts related to that. Baseline's an obvious one. Understanding ecosystems better in sensitive environments is another, and what resource might be of greatest concern. Also, I know right now there's a optics conference going on up in Maine on using developing tools for better sensing environmental issues. You can do some interesting translations of, as you said earlier, a measurement of X that translates to Y in terms of understanding the distribution. So those seem like a few things that could be done.
Anyone else? Well, if there's nothing else, I want other session chairs to note that we started on time and we ended 10 minutes early. So I'd like to thank my panel for their great job and wonderful job answering questions, and thank the audience for what I thought were some fabulous questions. So thank you all very much.